While we continue waiting for the release of new information about Pauline's death, let's take a moment to look ahead. What exactly does Mike hope to learn when the investigation's findings are finally shared? Now, no one is expecting a complete file to suddenly be made public. At best, what may come as a summary, something that sheds light on key questions, but still leaves much to speculation. That's why in today's video, Mike has organized his thoughts into 7 clear categories. He'll walk us through each one, outlining what he believes are the most important pieces of the puzzle. Along the way, Mike will share his own opinions and insights. Keep in mind, these aren't official conclusions. These are his personal thoughts, formed after years of looking into this case on his own, and are based on his review of available but limited information from newspaper reports, magazine articles, FBI reports, TBI correspondence dated prior to 1980, and interviews he conducted with people who lived the real story as it played itself out. The big question is, when that summary report is finally released, how closely will Mike's investigation line up with the official findings? Time will tell. For now, let's turn it over to Mike.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, and children of all ages. Now, to date, while we wait on District Attorney General Mark Davidson to make some sort of announcement about the findings of the TBI report that he has had since January, I wanted to just fill in a little bit of the time by expressing my own opinions. And that's all they are, is my opinions. I want to make that clear, of what I expect might be in the TBI report. And keep in mind that my findings are based on newspaper clippings about stories regarding Buford Pusser, magazine articles of the same, TBI correspondence prior to 1980 that I was able to locate, my interviews with people who lived their own part of the story as it played itself out back in the 1960s, and FBI reports, photographs, things of that nature. So I have no idea exactly how closely my results will compare with that of the report itself when it comes out. However, I do think I should be pretty close to getting everything right. As you know, I've always reported the time of the ambush as being 4:45 a.m. And the reason I've always said that was because that was the only time that you could find in just about any documents whatsoever. And those came from newspaper reports that are often highly inaccurate. So I would like to know if the TBI report pins down the exact time of the ambush. This is extremely important when you're looking things like this and trying to determine what's factual and what's not. That 4:45 a.m. time came from newspaper reports. I've never seen anything else that reported the time. So you have to wonder if that is accurate or not, because that plays heavily into the ambush. As a matter of fact, I would love to see an entire timeline about events surrounding the ambush that morning, the time that Buford got home, the time that they left home, what time the ambush occurred. And of course, it's been reported heavily that the time that they located Buford was around 6:20 a.m., with Buford being heard on the radio about 6:10 a.m. Are these times accurate? If they are, there's a lot of empty time to fill in there, and that would be very important to know. I do believe the TBI's report will address this time factor. If there is this empty time, you have to wonder, what were Buford and Pauline doing during that empty time? Did it actually occur before, after the ambush, or both? One of the key factors here that I hope that the report reveals something is the local medical examiner's report, photos, sketches, and how it compares with the state examiner's autopsy report and findings. Now, I do believe they will match. I don't believe that the local medical examiner would have agreed to have her body sent to the state medical examiner unless he had a good report to send along with it. Then I have the question about Pauline's wounds. If you recall, Buford said that she was wounded at the first ambush site and killed at the second ambush site. Now, that could be true, but I would like to see it in the reports themselves, or at least a summary of what the reports said, because Ward Moore, who was the county coroner at the time, and also the person that embalmed her body, seemed to have reported only one head wound. And the location of that wound should be interesting because the top of her head was blown off, according to Coroner Moore. And that means that she would probably have been shot near the base of the skull with the projectile exiting the top of her head. Now, that could explain the void on the door. If she was leaning over on that door, for instance, and she was shot in the base of the skull, would match the description that Moore gave, in my opinion, of course. Now, I don't believe that the District Attorney General or the TBI will release the photographs of Pauline or the sketches that may have been made by the local medical examiner. But I would be surprised if they failed to address this by giving some sort of statement in the summary about the nature of her wounds. I expect that to happen. Then we have the physical evidence in the form of the projectiles and the shell casings that were recovered the morning of August 12th. Now, we do know that from the McLeese letter that Steve Watson wrote to Jeffrey McLeese, the locations of many of those projectiles, where they hit the car, where they went out windows, through windows, and so on. And due to Dennis Hathcock, we have his story about where the shell casings were found on the roadway. Now, you put that together, and it seems to indicate that the shooter was not sitting in a Cadillac parked next to Buford, but rather was possibly out on foot firing into the car. And of course, that brings us to the trajectories of the shots fired. Did they come from a higher level? Were they more like what you would expect to find from somebody who was seated in a vehicle? There's all that to be determined. But personally, I think that whoever was doing the shooting was out on foot. Then you have the blood evidence. Buford said they never got out of the car. Neither he nor Pauline exited the vehicle, but yet there's blood out there on the hood. We've seen it. You know, it's one of those things you can't ignore once you see it, and you have to question, how did it get there, and whose was it? Now, I'm told that Buford and Pauline were different blood types, and hopefully the original reports have some information about which blood type was on the hood and whose it was. Was it Pauline's, where she was shot and killed there? Or was it Buford's, where he was wounded? And that leads us to wonder, why does his story not match the evidence out there? You know, there was also a palm print on the door frame. All sorts of things that bring up questions, which makes me doubt very highly Buford's story about the alleged ambush. Of course, I've always reported on things that occurred prior to the alleged ambush. The two ladies at the Old Hickory Grill that overheard Buford threatening Pauline's life. Dennis and Johnny seeing a gun exchange occur in Eastview that morning. Then there was Levon Plunk and what she reported to me. Then, of course, you also have Diane, who reported watching as Buford carried Pauline's body from the house and placing it in the car. Ward Moore being sent by Carl Pusser over to the Pusser residence, and what he observed, the blood droplets on the carpet. I reported these because I believe they were accurate. We'll soon know. One of the key factors that I would like to see would be the local medical examiner's report, his notes, sketches, photographs, whatever he has available, and compare that to what the state medical examiner recorded in his autopsy report. Do the wounds match? Was there more than one? Were there injuries around Pauline's neck? Other things that were observed on her body, bruising, things that might indicate abuse. All of these things are extremely important when you're looking at these things. I don't think the medical examiner would have sent in a false report or a doctored report. If there's any differences in these reports, it would reflect something very sinister to me. Now, the local medical examiner and the district attorney general had to concur on the need for an autopsy report. Apparently, either one or both of those gentlemen did not want an autopsy performed. Makes it very questionable. I personally think that the notes, the photographs, everything that we can find out from the state medical examiner's recent autopsy report may indicate that Buford was the one that was behind Pauline's death. And I say this because she was, by most accounts, especially that of Ward Moore, who was the coroner at that time, and he was also the person that embalmed her body, seemed to indicate that there was only one gunshot to the head, not the two that Buford claimed there to be, one where she was wounded at the first ambush site, and the second being one at the second ambush site, because that one wound took the top of her head off. And it seems most likely that that kind of a shot would have gone through the base of the skull and out the top of the head, thus taking the top of her head off. So that leads me to believe that Buford may have been behind Pauline's death. Therefore, I suggest that the current TBI investigation report will reveal that Pauline was probably only shot one time. Buford would often say that neither he nor Pauline ever got out of the vehicle that morning. Yet there's blood evidence all over the outside of the car. Whose blood is it? How did it get there? Look at the hood of that vehicle. Blood spattered, tailing off toward the back of the car, leaning slightly to the passenger's side. That indicates that somebody was standing in front of the vehicle. I would really be curious to find out what the TBI investigation report says or summarizes about that. What blood evidence was inside the vehicle? What concerns me, for one thing, is the void of the blood spatter pattern and trailing pattern on the passenger's door. That seems to indicate that Pauline was actually leaning on the door when she was shot in the base of the skull. The top of her head was blown off. She was alleged to have had a pile of her brain there on the shoulder of the road. Dennis Hathcock found a piece of her scalp with bloodied blonde hair in the ditch there. When you look at that, you look at the handprint that's on the outside of the car door on the driver's side. None of it makes sense according to Buford's story. That's another thing that leads me to believe that Buford was behind Pauline's death. I may be wrong, but remember, all I have to work with is the limited information that we currently have. I would not be surprised at all if during a news conference about this, they announce that everything that I have said is basically correct. I've always felt if I'd had access to the original file, I would be able to make a better assessment of the ambush itself. And by that I mean the crime scene documentation, photos, sketches, the officer statements from that day. So many things that we've not had access to. Then there is the matter of time and motion studies. As you know, I've tried to drive that in the daylight hours as well as in the nighttime hours at approximate time that Buford said that the ambush occurred. I couldn't make it work out. Hopefully, in the TBI's current investigation, they did a reconstruction of the ambush using a similar car and taking into consideration the distance between the church and the first ambush site, the time of night that it was, and see if their results are similar to mine. I would suspect that they absolutely are. I would also predict that the TBI and the District Attorney General will probably not release the names of a lot of the witnesses that they spoke with back then, and even more so, the witnesses that have come forward in just recent months to tell what they knew about the alleged ambush. I hope they address, and I predict they possibly might, discuss Dennis and Johnny seeing a car with Oklahoma tags. And hopefully, if they do, they'll provide some information on what kind of investigation went into that. It's hard to say on that point. Likewise, it's difficult to say if they'll mention the names of any suspects that might have had connection to the alleged ambush. With the possible exception of Buford, I do expect them to name him as a suspect in her death. I also predict that there is an excellent chance that they will discuss interference with the original investigation, that having come from Buford's friend and associate, Ray Blanton, who at one time was a sitting member of the House of U.S. Representatives and was later governor of Tennessee. And you have to keep in mind that Buford campaigned for Blanton, even though Buford was a Republican and Blanton was a Democrat. So friendships go a lot further than party affiliations. But as I said, it wouldn't surprise me at all if they mentioned possible interference by Blanton, as well as possibly some of the more local politicians. I'll leave it at that. Another point of interest for me has always been the law enforcement actions right after the ambush. I have to ask myself, was anyone else from Buford's department possibly involved in helping cover up the alleged ambush? And there, I'm thinking of people like his father, Carl, who didn't send calls through to Buford that night, who allegedly called Pauline just prior to the ambush and telling her that Buford was drunk, not to let him answer the phone, that he didn't need to be making calls that night. You have to wonder about Petey Plunk. Petey was telling people at the first ambush site, there's a sniper's nest up here, when there was no sniper's nest. You had to wonder about why he was trying to direct everyone's attention to these points. So A lot to be questioned. You have to wonder if any of the state officials, and by that, I'm again speaking about Ray Blanton, and if he interfered with what local investigators and local politicians were doing with the investigation, and whether or not he used his influence to interfere with the TBI's investigation. And we might also learn that they suspect that Buford's father, Carl Pusser, also had a hand in interfering with the investigation, as well as Petey Plunk. Just my thoughts. Another thing we have to consider is if there was any acknowledgement of rumors floating around the communities, cover-ups, things that people were discussing. Did the state officials look into that? Now, it is my personal opinion that they will probably announce that Buford was indeed involved in Pauline's murder. They may also announce that there were accomplices involved, either before, during, or after the murder. It is my expectation that they will say that Buford should have been charged with murder and tried in a court of law. It wouldn't surprise me also if they came out with the finding that this was probably not the first time that Buford had been involved in murder. Of course, there are many questions that will probably remain unresolved. Questions about Petey Plunk's possible involvement. I think there'll be questions about Jim Moffitt. I know for a fact that he knew that Buford was getting in over his head on a number of things. That he suspected Buford of the unnecessary death of Louise Hathcock. I do know that Jim was concerned about the fact that there were only a couple of times that he had not gone with Buford on these night calls, like occurred the morning of the ambush. And he said both times Buford was injured, either shot or stabbed. So you have to wonder if they'll address any of Jim's concerns. There's questions about Buford's involvement in organized crime. And he was always saying that the state line was after him, the Dixie Mafia was after him, some criminal element in the northern part of Mississippi were always after him. Over the years, there's been so many people that said that they had to make payoffs to Buford in numbers too great to ignore, I would think. I think the story itself lends a lot of credibility to the fact that Buford was indeed a corrupt sheriff that walked on both sides of the law. I have no idea if they will address any of these issues, but I certainly wish they would. It is my hope that when they do make an announcement of some kind, that it will bring some closure and clarity to the family. Grandchildren, great-grandchildren, siblings, and others in the family, of course. It's one of those things where it also needs to bring closure and clarity to Buford's legend. Just the way it is. I just wanted to get this out before the TBI and the District Attorney General make an announcement about the TBI's findings in their most current investigation. Now, I know that if I get some of this wrong, there's going to be a certain group of people out here, and we all know who they are, that are going to come out saying, well, see, this proves that he didn't know what he was talking about. However, if I get a lot of it right, they're going to be saying, well, he just got lucky. It was a good guess on his part. So there you have that. You just can't win with some people. So let me end this, as I always do, by saying, truth has no agenda, and thanks for watching.